The magical spear of Odin sounds like something straight out of Norse mythology. A godlike weapon, perhaps offered as the reward for completing a quest in a game of D&D. But the spear is real. It's in Ukraine right now, and thanks to Sweden, Ukraine has something so terrifying in its hands that Putin knows he can't stop what's coming. Gungnir has arrived, and there's nothing Russia can do about it. Russia knows that this is the case because Gungnir isn't just some weapon that Sweden has promised to deliver Ukraine at some point in the distant future. It's not only already in Ukraine, but it was used in one of the most devastating strikes that Ukraine has carried out against Russia's military and oil infrastructure in the Black Sea to date. We thought we knew everything that Ukraine was willing to reveal about that strike. On April 6th, the news broke that Ukraine's unmanned systems forces had worked alongside the country's naval forces to launch a devastating strike against Russia's Syvash offshore oil drilling platform in the Black Sea. While damaging that platform would be important for Ukraine in terms of landing another blow against Russia's oil industry, the real reason why it struck the Syvash platform was that Russia has been using it as a surveillance and military outpost for much of the war. Radars for short-range air defense systems have been loaded onto the platform, along with electronic warfare systems, all of which transformed it into a military asset rather than an oil one. Ukraine took Seash down. And as far as we knew, it did it using drones. That's essentially what the commander of Ukraine's unmanned systems forces, Robert Brovdy, claimed when he announced the attack in a Telegram post. The floating drill rig Seash was worked out by the birds of 413 Op. Reed, together with the forces of the Navy's deep-sea attack, Brovdy declared. And it's not like he was lying. Video soon surfaced of Ukraine attacking Syvash using drones, seemingly launched from maritime drones sent into the Black Sea. So that was it. The operation was done and dusted, and we knew how Ukraine had pulled it off. But looks can be deceiving, and Brovdy, purposefully or not, had left out a key part of the equation that has since been revealed. It wasn't just drones that struck Syvash on the night leading into April 6th. Ukraine had also unleashed Swedish Gungnir missiles. On April 7th, the Kyiv Post reported that the Ukrainian Navy had revealed, and then later confirmed, the use of the Swedish-made RBS-15 missile in the Syvash strike. Known as Gungnir, which loosely translates into the magical spear of Odin, the missile is an anti-ship powerhouse, and until this point, it wasn't really known whether Ukraine had the missile or not. The outlet reports that a video made public by Ukraine's Navy has revealed that Gungnir was used in the strike against Syvash, and that footage has sent a shockwave through Russia. Lasting for about 20 seconds, the footage shows Ukraine launching its Swedish missiles from what appears to be a ground-based platform. The Odin Warfare X account notes that this is the first public appearance made by the Gungnir in the Ukraine war, though it seems that Ukraine has had access to Sweden's powerful missiles for much longer. We'll be getting back to that point soon. First, the video shared by Odin Warfare appears to show 2 launches of the Swedish missile. The Kyiv Post adds that other footage that has surfaced shows those missiles scoring direct hits against the Syvash platform, which it says lies about 60 to 80 kilometers or about 37 to 50 miles northwest of the Crimean coast. Comparisons between the videos and clearer pictures of the launchers typically used for the Gungnir offer further confirmation that Ukraine has indeed deployed the Swedish missile. Don't ignore the proximity of the Syvash platform to the Crimean coast either. That gives you some indication of why Ukraine chose the specific oil drilling rig to target. The electronic warfare devices and air defense systems that Russia has loaded onto the Syvash platform were clearly in place to protect Russia's assets in Crimea. Now those defenses are burning. Struck by the magical spear of Odin, with follow-up strikes carried out by Ukraine's drones, that oil drilling rig can no longer act as an early warning system for occupied Crimea. We anticipate reporting on a strike against the Crimean mainland, perhaps against targets off the coast that Syvash was protecting in the very near future. But now we can confirm that the RBS-15 is officially part of Ukraine's arsenal. That has caught everybody off guard, not least Putin and his Kremlin cronies, who thought that Ukraine was increasingly being forced to rely on the missiles that it's building itself as its stockpiles of Western missiles dry up. Syvash just showed Putin that Ukraine isn't in a one or the other situation. It has both its own missiles and Western missiles, and it can use them to hit some of the most important military assets that Russia has in Crimea. So Putin has to deal with yet another Western missile being provided to Ukraine. And this is where things start to shift on the battlefield. The arrival of the Gungnir in Ukraine isn't just dangerous for Russia in terms of the firepower that the missile brings to the table. It's also yet another sign to Putin that his attempts to intimidate Sweden into staying neutral have failed. Russia has instead turned what for centuries had been a country that tried to stay out of war into one that is actively arming a Russian enemy and is doing everything that it can to stop Putin in his tracks. We'll be exploring the second of these points soon. Stick with us until then. As for the missile that Ukraine has just deployed to shatter Syvash, it's the last thing that Russia wants to see in Ukraine's hands. Why? A look at the basic specifications of the missile is enough to answer that question. Made by Saab Bofors Dynamics, the RBS-15, or Robot System 15 if we want to get non-Norse about it, is actually a full-blown family of anti-ship missiles that have been designed to combine the ship-shattering capabilities you'd expect from this kind of missile with a land attack capability that makes it extremely versatile. The missile's range can extend beyond 300 kilometers or 186 miles, though this depends on the specific version of the Gungnir that's used. The warhead weighs about 200 kilograms or about 440 pounds, and the missile is almost capable of hitting Mach 1. It comes in just under at Mach 0.9, but that still translates to a speed of about 690 miles per hour. So Ukraine has its hands on a missile that moves fast, hits hard, and has a long enough range to be used to strike all sorts of targets in the Black Sea, Crimea, and the occupied territories of mainland Ukraine. The Kyiv Post adds that the RBS-15 uses a combination of GPS and inertial navigation to stay on track when fired toward a target. It also has a terminal active radar, which gives it homing capabilities that feed into the fire-and-forget functionality that makes the missile so effective. That functionality offers precisely what it says on the tin. Ukraine can program a target into the missile, fire, and then forget about having to make any manual mid-flight adjustments, as the missile handles everything else itself. We mentioned earlier that the RBS-15 is actually a family of missiles. That's led to speculation about which versions Ukraine has and which it used to strike the Syvash oil rig. Naval News has some potential answers here. It says that the footage that Ukraine's Navy released of the missile being fired first confirms the use of the RBS-15 because we see a double exhaust plume emitted during the launch phase. That's a characteristic that the Swedish missile is known to have, and it's also one that is absent in all of the other missiles that Ukraine is known to have in its arsenal. The outlet adds that the version Ukraine used is likely to have been either the Mark III or Mark IV variety of the Gungnir, both of which have several upgrades over early iterations. The enhancement of the range up to and over 200 kilometers or 124 miles is one of those upgrades. Ukraine is using the Gungnir to attack Russian facilities in the Black Sea. That extended range is a must. It's also worth noting that Ukraine's target was a strange cross between land and sea-based. An offshore oil rig isn't exactly a ship, though you could argue that it shares some characteristics, especially as it's based in the ocean. At the same time, it's not really a land target, though it will have strengths and vulnerabilities that aren't seen on vessels. That mishmash makes the use of the Mark III or IV version of the RBS-15 even more likely, as these are versions of the Swedish missile that were made to be capable of striking targets on land and sea. Versatility, then, is key to what makes the magical Spear of Odin such a massive addition to Ukraine's arsenal. However, there's one more factor at play. That factor alone changes everything and makes the RBS-15 the perfect choice for the strike that Ukraine just pulled off. But before we get to that, this is a quick reminder that you are watching The Military Show. If this is the kind of insight that you want to see, make sure that you are subscribed to the channel. So the other factor. The RBS-15 was already a good choice for the attack on the Syvash based on its range and strength. However, there's something else about the platform that we mentioned earlier in the video that may have caught your attention. In addition to the air defense radars on the oil rig that Ukraine wanted to take out, Russia has been using the Syvash oil platform for its electronic warfare or EW devices. Through EW, Russia is able to scramble GPS signals and send both drones and missiles off course. That's where the RBS-15 comes into play. The missile has been optimized not only to operate in coastal and open sea environments, but it's also equipped with electronic countermeasures. In other words, the Gungnir has EW of its own that it can use to counteract the EW that Russia is employing against Ukraine's missiles and drones. It's a fire versus fire approach. And what it means is that the RBS-15 is innately resistant to the GPS jamming and spoofing techniques the EW devices loaded onto the Syvash platform employ that stop attacks just like the one that Ukraine pulled off on April 6th. So the magical Spear of Odin likely set the stage for what was to come later. Ukraine used its Swedish missiles to shatter Russia's Syvash EW systems, and then followed up with the drone strikes that we already knew about. Those drones, unencumbered by Syvash's EW presence, could then strike the oil drilling platform's air defense radars with a level of precision that wouldn't have otherwise been possible. This is an incredibly intelligent and layered approach to a strike. Ukraine once again has shown Russia that its approach to deep strikes goes far beyond merely pointing missiles and drones at a target and hoping they hit it. The Syvash strike was well planned at every stage, and the Gungnir was key to making the whole thing work. That will worry Putin. He knows that future strikes against Russian assets in Crimea have been made possible by the destruction of Syvash. But the real question he'll be asking himself is how on earth this happened in the first place. Russia has been caught with its pants down as Ukraine has unleashed a weapon that it hasn't used before. However, if Putin was paying attention, he would have at least had an inkling that something like this was coming. Though the arrival of the magical spear of Odin appears to have been quiet, it's actually the result of dealings between Ukraine and Sweden that have been a long time in the making. Sweden set out its stall pretty early when it came to who it supported following Putin's February 2022 invasion of Ukraine. Way back in June 2022, the country committed to a defense package that would see it send anti-tank weapons, 12.7mm rifles, and most importantly, RBS-17 anti-ship missiles to Ukraine. That particular missile is essentially the Swedish version of the US-made Hellfire, only it had been adapted so it could be launched from warships or via a ground firing post that could easily be set up and dismantled anywhere alongside Ukraine's coast. That was a warning to Russia. Sweden was willing to arm Ukraine with missiles from the very beginning of the war, and as Militani noted at the time, the far more powerful RBS-15 was still waiting in the wings. However, not a lot seemed to happen on the Swedish missile front for 2 years after the arrival of the RBS-17. And then something changed. We didn't hear much about it at the time, and it was underreported in the media, but according to the Kyiv Post, Sweden and Ukraine signed a deal at some point in 2024 for the transfer of RBS-15 missiles to Ukraine. That means one of two things: either it's taken around 2 years for Sweden to deliver on the deal, which is why we're only now seeing the emergence of the Gungnir in Ukraine, or Ukraine received this missile months, if not years ago, and it's been waiting for the perfect time to unleash it. Either way, Russia has just felt the power of the magical spear of Odin, and there could be a lot worse to come. The Kyiv Post adds that Sweden is far from the only country that uses the RBS-15. Thailand, Algeria, Bulgaria, Poland, Germany, Finland, and Croatia also operate the missile. Of those countries, all of the European nations are active supporters of Ukraine's defense against Russia, and they have all transferred weapons to Ukraine in the past. Now, we know that Sweden has signed a deal with Ukraine to transfer RBS-15 missiles, but what about Germany or Finland? Do they have deals in the works? Have those deals already been signed and we just haven't heard about them? Could negotiations for Gungnir transfers begin now that Ukraine knows exactly how useful its Swedish missiles can be against Russia? These are all questions that, for now, are unanswered. They are also questions that should be ringing out around the Kremlin, as many of these nations sending Gungnir missiles to Ukraine could mean that more attacks against facilities like Syvash lie in Russia's future. And it gets worse for Russia. Not only is Sweden supplying its Syvash shattering missiles to Ukraine, but it's actively working alongside Putin's enemy on the development of more missiles. That's according to Defense Express, which reported back in January 2025 that defense officials from Ukraine and Sweden had met to agree on a new joint initiative for the development of a long-range weapon. We haven't heard a lot more about that deal since the Defense Express report, but what it shows us is that military cooperation between Ukraine and Sweden is intensifying. Putin has to be wondering how things got to this point. Before he launched his invasion, Sweden seemed to be a non-factor to Russia. For 200 years before the Ukraine war, Sweden had steadfastly pursued a policy of military neutrality and non-alignment that was designed to ensure the country didn't get dragged into other people's wars. Then the tanks started rolling into Ukraine, and everything changed for the Swedes. For the first time in 2 centuries, Sweden saw a threat that it needed to work to counter. The attitude in the country became clear. First, Putin would target Ukraine. Then he might shift his attention to the Baltic and Nordic nations. Russia's aggression is what led to Sweden giving up 2 centuries of neutrality to become one of the newest members of NATO. That move was made official in March 2024, and it led to the expansion of the collective defense organization that Putin has often used as one of the reasons for launching his invasion in the first place. Russia wanted NATO to get smaller, to get rid of the nations on the eastern flank that Putin believes encroach too closely on Russia's territory. However, all that Putin has achieved with his invasion, at least from the Swedish perspective, is turning a neutral nation into an enemy. Beyond NATO, Sweden has also thrown its support behind Ukraine. We've touched on that already with the missile and weapons transfers that started as far back as June 2022, but the alliance between Sweden and Ukraine runs much deeper, and that's a major problem for the Kremlin. Since February 2022, Sweden has contributed over $13.7 billion to Ukraine's war effort. Deals are also being signed, as we see with the transfer of RBS-15 missiles to Ukraine. Other deals involve even more dangerous assets, such as the one signed between Ukraine and Sweden, that will see the latter deliver up to 150 of its Gripen fighter jets to Ukraine over the course of the next decade. Sweden even has Russia in its cultural crosshairs, as meetings between Sweden and Ukraine's cultural ministers show that it wants to work with its newest ally on de-Russification across the board. When Putin invaded Ukraine, he was meant to win quickly. The so-called special military operation would be over in days, and Russia will be able to use that victory to intimidate other European countries. But as Ukraine defended itself and Russia got bogged down in a war that's now lasted for more than 4 years, all Putin has succeeded in doing is being the catalyst for alliances to be forged that would never have existed if his forces had stayed put. Now, Sweden is an enemy, one that is actively treating Russia as the largest threat to its national security, which is what has laid the foundation for so much of the cooperation between Ukraine and Sweden that we're seeing today. So the magical spear of Odin being unleashed against Russia is important because of the immediate results that it has achieved. Ukraine's Swedish missiles have taken out a key Black Sea radar and EW outpost, and that will lead to the creation of more aerial corridors that Ukraine's missiles and drones can follow to hit Crimea itself. But perhaps more important than the strike itself is what the strike represents. Putin has created a Swedish monster, and now that this monster is working alongside Ukraine, nowhere in the occupied territories is safe from Ukraine's wrath. Gungnir isn't the only weapon inspired by Norse mythology that Sweden is using against Russia. Odin has been joined by Loki, as a new system by Saab has been developed that offers a pragmatic and cost-effective solution to the Russian drone problem. Check out what that weapon means and why it may be the future of European and NATO air defense in our video. And if you enjoyed this video, make sure you hit subscribe to stay ahead of the curve on the latest weapons that Ukraine deploys in its fight against Russia. And thank you for watching.